Now, next on stage, the microphone is yours. Arno Held with his speak as of this 3D conference. Welcome this guy, because he's a supersonic.
Thank you. I'll do the clicker. Okay, so the topic I'm talking about is survival rates and success in additive manufacturing. I already explained previously. I'm Arno Held. I run AM Ventures, a team of 7-8 people who are focusing on venture capital investments only in industrial 3D printing. So it's quite a narrow focus. I think we started early enough to conquer this niche for ourselves, because so far no one else can claim a portfolio as we have. We're right now the proud owners of a portfolio of almost 20 startups in additive manufacturing. Many of them you can see around here. Some of them are still in stealth mode. Actually, the one company that had to cancel their participation in today's presentation had to cancel it because they are in a deal closing with a very great investor in additive manufacturing. I think we have quite a nice overview of what's happening in the industry, and this is actually what I want to show you. I'd like to give you an insight into the daily struggle of startups. I want to show the startup guys that you guys are not alone out there. I know how tough it is. You suffer day in, day out. You have to, someone said it, improvise on a daily basis. Your world changes within seconds sometimes, as soon as a new customer comes on deck. And believe me, you're not the only ones. This is happening to every single one. Just very briefly, what I'm going to talk about. I'll show you what I've done in the past, the amounts of data that we have gathered. I'll show you a little bit who AM Ventures is, what we are doing. I'll explain what survival and success means in the world of venture capital investments, and I'll show you where are the startups actually globally, and how do they distribute across technical fields in additive manufacturing. So, it still doesn't work. Can I have the next slide, please? That's the great team that I have around me. That's a combined additive manufacturing experience of about 65 to 70 years. I started AM Ventures together with Johann Oberhofer. He's an industry giant. He's a dinosaur. So he was there in the first days of EOS back in 1989. Helped to raise the company to 100 million in revenue over the course of 20 years as a COO. And I have the honor of working right by his side and learning from him since the last seven years. These logos describe me a little bit. I dropped out of high school when I was 16. I did an apprenticeship with one of the best German machine tool manufacturers, and I'm really proud of that past. I became a service engineer actually with Trumpf. So I repaired laser machines, totally got into the laser business, and I assembled them. And I knew that laser is the kind of business that I would like to be in. And after studying industrial engineering in Karlsruhe, I wanted to find a new cool application in laser business, which was 3D printing, and that was 12 years ago. Vielen Dank. So 12 years ago, I joined EOS as the executive assistant of Dr. Hans Langer, who still owns the company, the Langer family. Got into strategy, into EOS business development, was there for 7 years in total, and 5 years ago I left the organization, and with an injection of the Langer family, we founded AM Ventures. Good. This is us, AM Ventures. We invest as early as possible, so you guys are actually our investment targets. Seed rounds, A rounds, even sometimes angel rounds. Ticket sizes range from $500,000 to about 3 to 4 million euros. We invested in 7 countries worldwide, ranging from Germany down to Australia and anything in between. Actually, we just opened an office in Busan in Korea to have a more deeper look into the Asian continent. And as I mentioned, we scouted far more than 1,000 startups. Actually, last week in our team meeting, we had the number 1,240 startups in additive manufacturing that we had a look at over the last 4 or 5 years. A little extract from our portfolio. You can also see it on the website. Some of them are pretty famous names, actually. 3Mind has a gigantic booth now over there. Really nice investment together that we have with Trumpf Ventures. Additive Works, simulation software from Bremen. Elementum 3D is a materials companies. We have many materials and hardware companies in our portfolio. Dimension is also to mention because it was our very first one. It's coloring equipment for SLS, so colors do exist already. And even more hardware from Switzerland, Sintratec, and from Vienna, Litos, as well as some applications, ex-Formula One teams with Conflux technology developing heat exchangers. But these are only the ones we invested in so far. We are very proud that our portfolio also has received a couple of awards, including ourselves as being the Investor of the Year from 3D printing industry last year. Vectorflow, Dimension, 3Mind have traveled the world through awards that they have won, and I'm pretty sure that pretty much all of you know them. Now let's come to what I would like to show you. I want to give you an insight into how successful startups are and what the survival rates of startups are in 3D printing. Of course, I know this view has some limitations. First of all, it's more or less my personal view. I started to gather the data when I was alone in an office and started to collect info or information about all the startups. That was Germany-centric, so this is how our view of the world grew. Then we looked into the United States and the remaining continents. What we did not look at are the entrepreneurial activities, which means projects within large corporations that result in startups, spin-offs, or some kind of additions to large corporations. And it's also, of course, a snapshot of the past 4 to 5 years. Actually, the research image was done last year in August, so we had 777 relevant startups in that view at that time. Now, what is survival and success? If you look at startups across the world, we can say that a startup is surviving if they acquire angel or seed funding, very early stage funding, the first couple of coins to develop a proof of concept, a prototype, or even generate the first revenues. This is what we call the company is surviving. Now, they become successful if they go into the more mature funding rounds and they can attract, let's say, more mature venture capital companies like BMT, like Trumpf Ventures, like ourselves. If you manage to put together an A round, this is sort of a solid success, I would say. It becomes really successful, of course, if you have an exit. An exit is a trade sale, so an acquisition by a large corporation, or even an IPO, which is probably the wet dream of most of the entrepreneurs. But those who have been part of an IPO and have seen it from a distance, how people suffer for many years after an IPO, they know that it's not always as nice as it shines. Okay, but this is probably the first interesting figure. As I said, 777 startups were relevant for this view, startups that we observed over the period of 4 years. After 4 years, there were only 23% left on a global average across all technical disciplines. Quite interesting. So 3/4 of startups vanish. Vanishing doesn't mean they die. Many entrepreneurs take their generated IP, the know-how, and bring it into a new company. In some countries, it happens quicker that they shut down a company and set up a new one. In other countries, it takes longer. But on average, as a reference, 3/4 of companies fail. Now we can apply a different view. How do we cluster the 177 surviving startups in additive manufacturing? There are 4 big categories which the investors that are looking into this field are categorizing. This is hardware, software, applications, and materials startups. You will see that the biggest chunk, more than 1/3 of the companies, are active in hardware. Now, why could this be the case? Our interpretation was that this is simply the oldest discipline, the most mature discipline. This is where it started. 3D printing is a hardware business, and over time, materials came into place. Software is still fairly young when we look at a history of almost 40 years of 3D printing across the planet. And one of the newest ones, which is becoming stronger and stronger, is actually applications. So 3D printed products like heat exchangers, like implants, like iPhone covers. Now let's look at the world. We try to also cluster the world into different regions and see where are the startups successful. And the way how we structure our planet is, of course, German-speaking Europe, the DACH region. We have the United States and Canada, but this is primarily United States of America in terms of activity. We have Asia-Pacific, European, Eastern Europe and Israel, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, France, Benelux and Luxembourg, a surprisingly strong region, and Middle East and Africa. South America, you will not find on the map because I think there was one single startup over 4 years that we have identified in South America. So it might be the lack of attention to that part of the world, but simply for us right now, there's not too much activity going on, similar to Middle East and Africa, if you exclude Israel. That's why we put it into the ERI region. So Eastern Europe and Russia and Israel are for us one big target region, which is extremely active. Now let's look at the survival rates of startups across the different regions. This is where it becomes really, really interesting. In terms of startup activities, North America and German-speaking Europe are quite similar, not too far apart from each other, which is, again, maybe due to our kind of radar. We grew out of Germany, out of Munich actually, and then US came later. What I find interesting, a very interesting observation, is that the failure rates in the United States are much, much, much higher than they are in German-speaking Europe. It's maybe not even surprising because we all know the saying in the United States, fail fast, fail cheap. You try something, you fail, you do the next one, and you do the next one, and you do the next one over and over again until you succeed. So this is what you can see in this kind of survival rates. The interesting thing for a venture capital investor is, of course, that the likelihood that my startup succeeds or is still there a couple of years after my investment is the high survival rates that we have in German-speaking Europe. And right now we also even see a little bit of a trend in the venture capital community that many VCs focus on German-speaking Europe because of these high survival rates. As I said earlier when Harry asked the question, I think it also shows a little bit the risk aversity that we have in Germany. A German engineer wants to be extremely perfect. They want to be in a safe haven. They love their big corporations like a Daimler and a Bosch and Siemens maybe. So if they have the idea that gives them the courage to set up a business, they have to be damn sure that it works. Otherwise they would not do it. And this is being reflected in the higher survival rates here. It was also interesting that we saw a lot of activity in Northern Europe, or let's say Scandinavia and Great Britain. We have many startups coming from England especially and Sweden especially. But we can also say there is a high amount of failure. Maybe it's because it's an Anglo-Saxon kind of entrepreneurial culture. People dive into experiments really quickly, find that something else works better, and they set up the next company. But the amount of startups that we see in this region of the world is very interesting, and it also triggered us to put more resources in scouting into Northern European regions. France, Benelux countries are also have a very high amount of activity. So far, they brought a couple of very interesting startups. One of the winners last year, Aerosint, is a company from Belgium, if I remember correctly, which also left a very nice impression. Southern Europe was a little bit disappointing, as you can see. We have an 8% survival rate. 91% of startups from Italy, Portugal, and Spain die on the way. Now, this might be because of the lack of funding infrastructure, maybe even because of the lack of industrial players who can help pushing them, because what we of course also see is that the closer a startup is to an industrial area like Munich and surroundings, like Berlin in the United States, the Boston area or Silicon Valley, the higher is the likelihood to survive the next couple of years to become successful, because you have your key customers there, you can generate a lot of talent, and therefore being close to your customers is always a really good advice. Quick comparison, again, what I just said, by far the highest likelihood to succeed is in the German-speaking part of Europe. United States is still quite a big part behind, and the rest is not so really great. I was just told I have to speed up a little bit, and we can have a discussion afterwards. I'm also happy to share the slides if you're interested in this. This is just an overview how the startups are segmented across the different regions of the world. Very quickly, very strong focus on applications and on hardware in Germany, or in the German-speaking part of Europe, whereas the United States have a very heavy focus on software startups. Might not be surprising, but it's also very interesting to have this on paper and with real data as a proof. I'll show two additional regions, and then we can have a discussion maybe over a beer or at the table. What I found quite interesting here is how the startup companies are distributed around the world. As I said, we have almost 400 startups that we saw that are hardware related. Some of them survived, but not too many. Actually, 83% of them died. And this was, at least to my interpretation, due to the fact that we have some sort of dominant designs already established and very mature players that are dominating the market, and that has a very, very high threshold to overcome so that you can acquire a certain relevant position in the market. That means if you want to develop a technology that beats EOS, that beats Trumpf, that beats whoever is out there, it costs you a lot of money, a lot of firepower, and that is industrial support, and cannot be done with a startup business anymore, maybe as it was possible 15 or 20 years back when some of the world market leaders today were born. And then software companies, interesting, a lot higher likelihood to survive compared to the hardware businesses. That's most likely, to my interpretation, because it's quite a young business. We are now starting to have the computing power, the capacities to run high resource simulations, for example. We have skilled people now leaving the universities that have heard about 3D printing at university. Wow, I did not hear that when I studied. And that generates now startup companies and use cases for software in industrial kind of applications. And therefore, it's a quite immature field which normally has much higher likelihoods to survive. If you want to take a picture of the applications or have a chat, I'm happy to give some details later on, same as materials. Just the conclusions that we drew from this. We have a home turf advantage. As an investor, what we can see is the more time that we spend with our investments, the higher is the likelihood to survive. Right now, of the 19 companies that we have in our portfolio, we have not lost a single one. Every single one is very successful. That is quite remarkable in the venture capital business, in my opinion, but it shows that you have to spend a lot of time with your entrepreneurs and work very, very hard on the success. What was also interesting for us, and actually this study led us to establish an office in South Korea, in Busan. We have no idea about Asia. If we have already 200 startups in German-speaking Europe and more than 400 in the United States, there must be at least the same potential in Asia, especially in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. And we have no idea what's happening there, so this has to change. Dominant business model is a part that I did not go into right now, because the second part of my evaluation was how is a chosen business model connected to the success and survival of a company. So the key learning was that recurring revenues is the key. So just the hardware business doesn't work. No startup can survive without any recurring revenues. If you have a great product that locks your customer into your business, you have to milk the customer. You have to make money from these guys because they are locked in. So this is, in my opinion, the most important learning. Look for the recurring revenues. Look where you can generate money from those customers that you have already acquired. And maybe the last thing right now is applications win. Everyone in this industry, including us investors, we are looking for the applications. This is going to change the world. It's not the hardware, it's the products that are going to change the world. So if you have any great products, send them to me and to Franz and to Kevin. Thanks.